After acquiring a multi-billion-dollar hotel, I walked into its grand lobby only to be racially profiled, humiliated, and thrown back out onto the street. Little did they know, they had just ejected their new owner. The rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the opulent gold lettering of the Grand Elysian Hotel on the glass doors. I barely noticed. I was slouched in one of the ridiculously plush armchairs in the lobby, the kind that costs more than a used car, and I was utterly exhausted. It had been a brutal week, a 72-hour negotiation marathon that ended with my company, Apex Innovations, acquiring our largest competitor. It was a legacy-defining deal, the kind of thing they write about in business magazines, and all I wanted to do was check into our suite, take a hot shower, and wait for my wife, Sarah, to arrive. I was wearing my travel uniform, a simple black hoodie, comfortable joggers, and a pair of worn-in sneakers. It wasn't exactly bespoke tailoring, but the hoodie alone was from a designer whose name you'd only know if you had too much money and a personal shopper. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was trying to breathe. My phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "Traffic is a nightmare. Be there in 20. Order me a glass of champagne, my love. You deserve a whole bottle." I smiled. A genuine, tired smile. She was right. I pushed myself out of the chair and headed towards the polished marble bar tucked into the corner of the lobby. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and old money. I could feel a pair of eyes on me as I walked. I was used to it. Being a 6'3" black man in spaces like this often came with a free surveillance detail. I ignored it and took a seat at the bar. The bartender, a slick-haired man in his late 20s, was meticulously polishing a glass. He saw me, made a flicker of eye contact, and then deliberately turned his back to rearrange some bottles. I waited. A minute passed. Then 2. A well-dressed older white couple sat down 2 stools away from me, and the bartender was on them in a heartbeat. "Good evening. What can I get for you?" he chirped, his smile as bright as the chandelier above us. I cleared my throat, not aggressively, just enough to be noticed. He finished taking their order, turned, and his smile vanished as his eyes landed on me again. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone flat, laced with something between boredom and suspicion. "Yes," I said, keeping my voice even. "I'd like to order a bottle of your best champagne, a Dom Perignon, if you have it." His eyebrows shot up. A smirk played on his lips. "That's a very expensive bottle, sir." The "sir" was an insult. "I'm aware," I said calmly. "I'd like it sent up to the Celestial Suite. The name is Davies. Marcus Davies. And a glass for my wife when she arrives." He didn't move to get the bottle. Instead, he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Look, I don't know what you're doing, but this isn't the kind of place you can just walk into and run up a tab. We require a credit card on file for all purchases." I felt a familiar hot coil of anger begin to tighten in my stomach. I'd been dealing with this my whole life, the assumption that I didn't belong, that I couldn't afford it, that I was a threat. I'd built a billion-dollar company from the ground up, but in this moment, to this man, I was just a guy in a hoodie who was out of his depth. "That won't be a problem," I said, pulling my wallet out. I placed my American Express Centurion card on the bar. It's a sleek, black piece of anodized titanium. There's no credit limit. He glanced at the card, his smirk faltering for a second, before he seemed to decide it had to be a fake. Before he could say another word, a heavy hand landed on my shoulder. I turned to see a burly security guard, the same one who'd been watching me earlier. His name tag read, Peterson. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me," he said, his voice a low growl. "Excuse me, I'm a guest here. I'm waiting for my wife." "We've had some complaints," Peterson said, his grip tightening. "You're making other guests uncomfortable." I looked around. The older couple was pointedly staring away. No one was looking at me except the bartender and the guard. "What complaints?" I've been sitting quietly. A woman with a severe haircut and a clipboard marched over, her heels clicking aggressively on the marble. The manager. "Is there a problem here, Peterson?" she asked, not even looking at me. "This man is refusing to cooperate, Miss Albright. He was harassing the bartender." My jaw dropped. Harassing? I was trying to order a drink. Ms. Albright finally turned her cold eyes on me, her gaze sweeping over my hoodie and joggers with undisguised contempt. We have a certain clientele to maintain, and a dress code to uphold. Clearly, you don't meet our standards. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Now, this was it. The breaking point. The exhaustion of the week, the quiet condescension, the outright lies. It all coalesced into a cold, hard knot of fury in my chest. You have no idea who you're talking to, I said, my voice dangerously low. Peterson laughed, a short, ugly bark. Oh yeah? Who are you? The King of England? He started pulling me off the stool. Let's go. Out. They were physically forcing me out of the bar, across the lobby. Humiliation burned my cheeks. All my success, all my wealth, meant nothing. In their eyes, I was just a trespasser. As they shoved me toward the revolving doors, they swung open, and standing there holding her suitcase with a look of pure shock and horror on her face was my wife, Sarah. "Marcus!" she cried out. They pushed me past her, out into the cold, driving rain. The door spun shut behind me, leaving me on the wet pavement, soaked and seething. I stood there for a moment, the rain plastering my hair to my forehead, watching my wife argue frantically with the manager through the glass. Then, the anger inside me solidified. It turned from hot rage into something cold, sharp, and focused. I pulled out my phone, my fingers moving deliberately across the wet screen. I didn't call the front desk. I didn't call the police. I scrolled through my contacts to a name saved simply as Henderson, CFO. He was not just the chief financial officer of Apex Innovations. He was also on the board of the Global Hospitality Group, that, as of 3 days ago, now owned the Grand Elysian hotel chain. He picked up on the first ring. "Marcus, I was just about to email you the final paperwork. Congratulations again." I turned my back to the hotel, the water dripping from my chin. "Richard," I said, my voice devoid of all emotion, "cancel the email. I want you to get every single board member on an emergency conference call. In 5 minutes. There's been an incident at the New York flagship. And while you're at it, find out the full names of the night manager, the lobby bartender, and the security guard named Peterson. It seems my first act as the new owner is going to be some immediate and rather aggressive restructuring." The line was silent for a moment before Henderson's professional calm cracked. "They did what? Marcus, are you okay? Should I call the police?" The concern in his voice was genuine, but my mind was already several steps ahead, operating with the cold, detached clarity that had made me a fortune. "No police, Richard. This is a corporate matter now. Get the board on the line. I want names. I want to know who is responsible for training the staff at this flagship location. Get me the regional director's personal cell number. Now." The rain was cold, but I barely felt it. I was burning from the inside out. Inside, through the distorted rain-streaked glass, I could see Sarah. My fierce, brilliant Sarah. She wasn't crying. She was arguing. Her hands were moving, chopping the air with indignation as she spoke to Ms. Albright, who was looking down at her with that same dismissive contempt she'd shown me. Peterson stood behind her, arms crossed, a smug mountain of a man. The bartender was back at his station, likely recounting his heroic defense of the bar from the likes of me to the older couple. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully sanitized their precious lobby. My phone buzzed again with an encrypted link to a conference call. I tapped it, the familiar chime sounding as I joined. "Gentlemen," I began, my voice steady despite the fury simmering beneath. "Apologies for the emergency meeting. 3 days ago, we spent $4.8 billion acquiring the Grand Elysian Hospitality Group. I am currently standing outside our New York flagship hotel in the pouring rain because the staff has just physically ejected me from the premises." A chorus of stunned silence and muffled gasps came through the speaker. They did so under the assumption that a black man in a hoodie could not possibly be a paying guest. This isn't just a customer service failure. This is a systemic rot that goes to the very core of the brand we just purchased. Our multi-billion-dollar asset is a liability. As I laid out my initial plan, a text from Henderson came through with the names: Manager, Carol Albright. Security, Frank Peterson. Bartender, Leo Petrov. And the cell number for the Regional Director of East Coast Operations, a Mr. Robert Sterling. I thanked the board and disconnected the call just as the hotel's main door swung open again. It was Sarah, her face a mask of cold fury. "Marcus, I told them who you were." They laughed. "The manager said if I was really your wife, I should have taught you how to dress appropriately for high-end establishments." That was it. Any tiny flicker of doubt, any thought that this was just a misunderstanding, was extinguished. This wasn't ignorance. This was malice. I took her hand. "It's okay, honey. Let's go back inside." She looked at me confused. "But they won't let us in." I gave her a look she knew well, the one I got right before I closed a hostile takeover. "They will." We walked back toward the revolving door. As we stepped through, all three of them, Albright, Peterson, and Petrov, snapped to attention. Their expressions curdled from shock to outrage. "I told you to leave the premises," Albright shrieked, her professional veneer cracking into something ugly. Peterson started moving towards me, his hand reaching for my arm again. "That's it. You're trespassing. I'm calling the cops." "I wouldn't do that," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the suddenly quiet lobby. I held up my phone and pressed the call button for the number Henderson had sent me. It rang twice. "Robert Sterling's office." "This is Marcus Davies," I said clearly. "I believe you're expecting my call." At the same time, the phone at the front desk began to ring with a shrill, insistent chirp. Albright, distracted from me, shot an annoyed glance at the receptionist and stomped over to answer it herself. "Grand Elysian, this is Carol Albright. How can I—" She stopped. Her posture went rigid. I could see the color drain from her face as she listened, her eyes wide and fixed on me. Peterson had frozen mid-stride, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "Yes, Mr. Sterling," Albright whispered into the receiver, her voice trembling. "Yes, he's right here. I didn't realize. Yes, sir. I understand." She placed the receiver back on the cradle with the care of someone handling an unexploded bomb. Her face was ashen. She looked at me, no longer with contempt, but with pure, undiluted terror. I ended my own call without another word, and slipped the phone into my pocket. I looked at the three of them, a tribunal of mediocrity, who had judged me unworthy. Carol Albright, Frank Peterson, Leo Petrov. I said their names slowly, deliberately, letting the weight of them hang in the air. 20 minutes ago you expelled me from my property. Now I'm terminating your employment. Peterson's jaw worked silently. The bartender looked like he was going to be sick, but Albright, recovering a sliver of her earlier arrogance, took a step forward. "You can't do that. There are procedures. There are HR policies." "Ms. Albright," I interrupted, my voice as cold as the rain I was still dripping on their floor. "You are correct. There are procedures. My team will be here at 6 a.m. to begin them. But they won't be processing your severance. They will be conducting a full, top-to-bottom audit of this hotel and this entire brand. Every employee file, every guest complaint, every performance review for the last 5 years. You see, I've realized this isn't about the three of you. You're just a symptom of the disease." Just then the elevator doors dinged open, and a flustered, red-faced man in a pristine suit practically ran out, smoothing his tie. He was sweating profusely. "Mr. Davies, Robert Sterling, I came down as fast as I could. On behalf of the Grand Elysian, I am so sorry for this egregious misunderstanding." He held out a hand to shake. I ignored it. I looked past him at the gilded logo on the wall, at the chandeliers, at the whole opulent facade. "A misunderstanding, Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice dangerously soft. "No. This was a moment of absolute clarity. It showed me exactly what I have purchased. And now you're all going to find out exactly what kind of owner I am." Robert Sterling flinched as if I'd slapped him. His outstretched hand dropped to his side, limp and useless. "Mr. Davies, please," he stammered, his eyes darting around the now silent lobby. The other guests were no longer pretending not to watch. They were captivated. The remaining staff stood frozen like statues, their faces pale. This was no longer an incident. It was a corporate execution happening in real time. A misunderstanding, Mr. Sterling, I repeated, my voice dangerously calm. A misunderstanding implies a lack of information. What I just experienced was a judgment made with an abundance of prejudice, a judgment that your manager, your security, and your bartender felt completely comfortable making, which tells me this is not an anomaly. It's the culture. He started to babble, the practiced words of corporate damage control spilling out. We can compensate you, of course. The Celestial Suite is yours for life. We can arrange a private dinner, anything you want. We pride ourselves on our 5-star service. Stop, I said, and the single word cut through his panic like a knife. I don't want your 5-star service because I've just discovered it doesn't exist. Not for everyone. I want answers. Tell me, Mr. Sterling, what is the protocol for de-escalation training for your security staff? What are the specifics of the diversity and inclusion modules all your employees are required to take annually? He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He had no idea. These were just boxes to be checked on a corporate memo, not principles to be instilled. Well, we have a comprehensive HR program, he began weakly. I'm sure you do, I said, taking a step closer. Sarah placed a gentle hand on my arm, a silent reminder to keep my cool. I squeezed her hand back, a small acknowledgement. Let me ask you another question. In the last year, how many formal complaints of discrimination have been filed against this specific hotel, and what was the outcome of each investigation? His face went from pale to ghostly white. He knew, and he knew that I would soon know. I'd have to check the records. Yes, you would, I agreed. But you won't, because you are the regional director. The culture of every hotel in your territory, from the bellhops to the managers, is your direct responsibility. Your failure to oversee their training, your failure to investigate their prejudices, and your failure to cultivate an environment where a guest isn't physically assaulted based on the color of their skin and the clothes on their back. That is a catastrophic failure of leadership. I let the words hang in the air, the silence in the lobby so profound I could hear the rain still beating against the glass doors. I looked at Albright, whose face was a crumpled mess of tears and disbelief. I looked at Peterson, who was staring at the floor, his bravado completely gone. I looked at Leo, the bartender, who seemed to have shrunk behind the bar. They were the architects of their own demise, but he was the man who had given them the blueprints and then looked the other way. So no, Mr. Sterling, I continued, my voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the result of your negligence. You are a liability to my brand. You are also terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you out. I glanced at the other 2 security guards standing near the entrance, who looked at each other in terrified confusion. A collective gasp went through the lobby. Firing floor staff was one thing. Firing a regional director on the spot was a declaration of war. Sterling looked utterly broken, his expensive suit suddenly seeming too big for him. I then turned my attention to the remaining staff, the frightened-looking receptionist, the 2 deer-in-the-headlights bellhops. I addressed them all. My name is Marcus Davies. As of this week, my company owns this hotel. What you have just witnessed is the new standard of accountability. This is day 1. I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. A message from Henderson. Board has unanimously approved your proposed course of action. They are standing by for your next directive. I took a deep breath, the cold fury beginning to recede, replaced by a glacial resolve. This was bigger than my humiliation. It was an opportunity, a responsibility. I looked at my watch. It was just after 9 p.m. Sarah watched me, her expression a mixture of pride and concern. She knew I wasn't done. The firings were just the amputation. Now it was time to cut out the cancer. I pulled out my phone one more time and dialed a number from my favorites. It was answered before the first ring finished. Valerie. Marcus, a crisp, efficient voice replied. Valerie Morgan, my head of human resources. A woman who could find a lie in a silent room. Valerie, change of plans. I'm not waiting until 6 a.m., I said, my voice low and clear, but loud enough for the terrified staff to hear every word. I want your team at the Grand Elysian, New York in 1 hour. Not the audit team, the investigative team. I want every hard drive in the management offices secured. I want all personnel files frozen. And I want you to start with the complaint logs. I have a feeling Ms. Albright wasn't the first manager to make a guest feel unwelcome. I paused, locking eyes with the petrified receptionist, whose hand was hovering over her keyboard, as if she was considering deleting a lifetime of sins. We're not just cleaning house, Valerie. We're excavating a tomb. 1 hour. That's how long it took for the old Grand Elysian to die and for my version to be born. Valerie's team descended on the hotel like a SEAL team on a covert op. They were quiet, professional, and utterly ruthless in their efficiency. Laptops were imaged, servers were locked down, and paper files were boxed and sealed under the terrified gazes of the remaining night staff. The lobby, a stage for opulence and exclusion just moments before, had become a sterile corporate crime scene. Sarah and I finally went up to the celestial suite. The bottle of Dom Perignon was waiting, perfectly chilled, a silent testament to an order placed in another lifetime. We didn't open it. Instead, we sat on the silk sofa overlooking the glittering, rain-slicked Manhattan skyline, and for the first time that night, I let myself feel the bone-deep exhaustion. Was that too much? I asked her, my voice quiet. She took my hand, her fingers lacing through mine. You did what you had to do, Marcus. You didn't just buy a hotel. You bought its problems. You just chose to solve them on your first day. The next morning the sun broke through the clouds. My team had worked through the night. The initial findings were worse than I could have imagined. Valerie's team had uncovered a deeply entrenched pattern of discriminatory practices, artfully buried in coded language within internal reports. Guest complaints from people of color were routinely dismissed as aggressive or unreasonable. Job applications with ethnic-sounding names were systematically filtered out. Frank Peterson, the security guard, had over a dozen complaints of excessive force and racial profiling filed against him, all of which had been investigated and dismissed by Carol Albright. Leo the bartender was caught on security footage bragging about how he intentionally ignored certain guests to preserve the bar's atmosphere. It wasn't a few bad apples, it was a poisoned orchard, and Robert Sterling was the one who had refused to tend to it. I didn't call a press conference. I didn't want a spectacle. I wanted a statement. At 9 a.m., a press release went out from Apex Innovations. It didn't mention my personal experience. It simply stated that following the acquisition of the Grand Elysian Group, an immediate internal audit had revealed systemic failures in management and HR practices that violated both company policy and ethical standards. It announced the termination of the regional director and several key staff members at the New York flagship, and the launch of a company-wide top-to-bottom overhaul of training, hiring, and guest relations protocols. It also announced the establishment of a multi-million-dollar independent fund to reinvestigate and compensate any guests who had been subject to discriminatory treatment at any of their properties in the last 5 years. The story went viral anyway. Someone in the lobby that night had filmed the entire confrontation on their phone. By noon, the video of me firing a regional director in my own hotel lobby was everywhere. The narrative wasn't what I'd intended, but the effect was the same. The message was clear. The old guard was out. 3 months later, I walked through the lobby of the Grand Elysian again. It looked the same marble floors, the same crystal chandeliers. But it felt different. The air was lighter. The new manager, a sharp, incredibly competent woman I'd poached from a competitor, greeted me with a warm, genuine smile. The staff was more diverse, more attentive, more welcoming. The changes weren't just cosmetic. We had implemented a new anonymous complaint system overseen by a third-party ethics committee. We had revamped the entire hiring process to focus on skill and empathy. We had invested in real, substantive training that taught our staff how to create an inclusive environment, not just how to tick a box on a form. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah, who was meeting me for lunch. "Running 5 minutes late. Order me a glass of champagne, my love. You deserve a whole bottle." I smiled. This time when I walked to the bar, the young woman behind it greeted me immediately. "Good afternoon, Mr. Davies. Welcome back. What can I get for you today?" "A bottle of your best champagne, please," I said. "And 2 glasses." As she said about preparing the order, I looked around the lobby. I saw an elderly Sikh gentleman in a turban reading a newspaper in one of the plush armchairs. I saw a young black family checking in, their children gazing up at the high ceilings with wonder. I saw a place that was finally living up to the name over its door. A place that was truly grand. We hadn't just cleaned house, we had rebuilt it from the foundation up, on the simple principle that luxury is worthless without dignity. And that was a legacy worth far more than the $4.8 billion it had cost me to buy it.